The poem I'm going to talk about today is called 奉赠韋左丞丈二十二韵, respectfully presented to Vice Director of the Left, the senior Wei, 22 couplets. 22 couplets, 44 5-character lines. So you see I'm getting creative now at squeezing in these longer and longer poems on this introductory black page that I'm doing at the beginning. So I want to display the whole poems to you so you can see and read them comfortably. And this one is the longest yet, I think. And this poem is interesting for a number of reasons, and it's chiefly interesting in a sort of autobiographical way, actually. This is a poem that really tells us something about Du Fu's inner life, and he talks quite straight about himself. Of course, in a sense, we can say that all poems by a poet in the tradition that Du Fu was working in, with the assumptions that were current about people always writing about sort of the truth about themselves, and poems taking as their subject matter daily life in a much more comprehensive way than we are used to in the Western tradition. We could say that a lot of poems are keys to the poet's inner life, but this is really a poem where he talks about himself quite a lot, and that makes it interesting. And the context here is also perhaps worth noticing. So it's a poem that's presented to this man, this vice director of the left, the senior Wei, this Wei Zuo Cheng. His name was Wei Ji, and he was a quite successful administrator, public official. And reading the historical sources, we can see that he was known for his great honesty and competence. And this is a person that Du Fu has actually already addressed 2 poems to earlier in his collection, which I haven't treated in this video series because I didn't find them interesting enough. But they are both, in a way, a little bit similar to this one. So all of these 3 poems are really Du Fu sort of asking in one way or another for help with employment, because of course his ambition was to enter the bureaucracy, and it wasn't going very well for him. It never went really well for him. And Wei Ji was one person that he appealed to, we might say. And yes, this vice director of the left, this is a kind of Zuo Cheng. Zuo Cheng is an official title of sort of middle rank. It had a supervisory function in the Shangshu Sheng, or Department of State Affairs as it's sometimes known in English. Zhang, I'm just noticing these language details here. Zhang is short for Zhangren, which is a term of respect for a member of an older generation, so that's why it says the senior Wei here. And I think he actually addresses him as Zhang or Zhangren in all of these 3 poems. This was probably written in 752 or so, when Du Fu was leaving Chang'an for a visit to Luoyang. But they are here in Chang'an, as will be seen in the poem. And yes, let's just start talking. I've already started talking. 纨绔不饿死，如官多误身. Those in fine silk pants don't starve to death, but a scholar's cap often ruins a man. So I was about to say that this poem is actually very direct, and that's what's interesting about it. And the other 2 poems that Du Fu had written to this Wei Ji are not as direct at all. Actually, they are more sort of very you can tell that this is a person that Du Fu respects a lot, and that he expects to he puts high hopes in him, because he believes that he would be able to help Du Fu. But he is frustrated, and his way of treating of saying this to him here becomes extraordinarily direct. And you know, in compared to sort of the modern Western world, the way that people expressed themselves in the Tang Dynasty was not very direct at all. So we always have to adjust our expectations a little bit. This is very direct by Tang Dynasty standards. That's what I'm about to say. So here he makes immediately makes a contrast with sort of the privileged position that Wei Ji, the recipient, finds himself in, and his own position. So that's the whole sort of premise for the whole poem. Wan Ku, this means fine silk pants. So Wan is fine silk, and this Ku is actually just the same character as Ku, the Ku. So those in fine silk pants, these are the clothes of the nobility, and they will never worry about starving to death. But in contrast, a scholar's cap, Ru Guan, a scholar's cap often ruins a man, or rather, people in scholars' caps are often ruined or end up poor. And yeah, as I said, the other two poems to Wei Ji are really indirect. They're elusive, even though they're still plainly obvious in sort of their intent. But this is also why I didn't choose to talk about those two poems, because I think this way of being indirect and elusive, while still being so pretty obvious that he just wants sort of material advantages from him, it creates a rather uncomfortable impression. But here he really says exactly what's on his mind. So we go on and you can see, 丈人视镜听，见子请具臣. Like, this kind of couplet, it has clear poetic precedence. Like, listeners, hush, I'll tell you a story. Like, mister, just sit here and listen and I'll tell you what's going on. But here it's really Du Fu who's going, I think, it's Du Fu who goes, like, sorry, I respect your rank, mister, but you deserve to hear this because of my respect for you. Like, I don't consider myself your inferior, and if you can't be of any use for me, this is it from now on. Basically, that's what he's saying to him, as will be clear later. So I think Du Fu, he really tries to put Wei Ji in a position where he really has to say yes or no. Like, are you going to help me or not? And that's what the rest of the poem is about. And he will tell us quite a lot about himself from the starting point. So he just makes it clear to him that he's going to be brutally honest about himself, and then it's up to Wei to sort of take steps from there on. And since Du Fu, I don't think he actually ever dedicated another poem to Wei Ji, this was actually it from there on. But this has become quite a famous poem in that regard, and Wei Ji has entered the history as another of the guys who didn't help Du Fu. So 丈人 here, as I said, is Wei Ji, and 见子, of course, is Du Fu himself. And I'll tell you all, 请具臣, tell you in detail. 夫昔少年日，早充棺椁兵. Here the story starts. In days gone by, when I was young. So, all of this, you can read the English translation for yourself. All of this probably refers to when Du Fu was taking the Jinshi examination. And at that point he was like 25 years old, so it was when he was a 少年, young. At this point he is about 40. Language-wise, here, 早充棺椁兵. This 棺椁兵, the translation is weird here, and it is perhaps a bit obscure, so I'll explain this one to you. In the I Ching, the Book of Changes, there's a line under the hexagram called Guan. So Guan is one of the 64 hexagrams in the I Ching. And the line under the hexagram Guan, in the fourth line, says, 观国之光，利用兵于王. That is, I translate, observing the splendor of the state, or the realm, as it says here. 国之光, the splendor of the state. It is advantageous to present a guest to the king. 利用兵于王. So this is like the reason that Stephen Owen puts Guan here in and capitalizes it like this is because he wants to make clear that he refers to the hexagram in the I Ching, but it looks extremely obscure, and I'm not sure it's actually correct. I understand it more as a realm observing guest, like a guest that is made to observe the state of the country, which is sort of the position that you might see that you find yourself in if you're like a candidate for the imperial examinations. You're there in the capital, and you can sort of you're able to observe some things, but you don't fill any other function. And also, this Chong has this somewhat negative feeling, like he was just one of a great number of people. He was like filling a slot, as it were. Then he continues talking about himself. 读书破万卷，下笔如有神。In reading, I wore out 10,000 scrolls. Yeah, either it's wore out 10,000 scrolls. That's certainly one possible interpretation. I understand it that he has sort of cracked the meaning of all of these books that he's been reading, and that's because he understands all of these books. That means he has, as it were, the true source of all things available at his fingertips. And as a result, he can 下笔如有神, he can write as if guided by a god. So this tells you something about Du Fu's own opinions about his capacities, and it's interesting actually. You can sort of ask yourself, and it's a question that I ask myself all the time when reading this, like, did Du Fu know that he was Du Fu? And it's something that you can ask yourself about like Shakespeare and other people like this as well. Did they know that they were the center of the canon, of the future canon, as it were? And I think Du Fu had actually a fair idea of his own capabilities, which we actually can see in a poem like this, and that's why it's so interesting. 父料杨雄底，诗看子见卿. And here you see exactly what I mean. Here he compares himself to like really great figures of ancient literature. So he's got Yang Xiong, which was the Han Dynasty writer, who was famous not only for his Fu poetry, but also for his quite cryptic prose. It's really a very difficult author. And his so-called improvement of the I Ching, the Taixuan Jing. And by the way, there are Fu in Du Fu's collection. Fu poems, even though I don't think I will talk about them. There are 3 very famous Fu on the august theme of imperial sacrifices, which he submitted to the throne in what was ultimately an unsuccessful attempt to get an important position. So Du Fu did know how to write Fu, and rightly he reckoned himself to be the rival of Yang Xiong here. Liao reckoned or considered myself, he actually is like literally to weigh oneself to be, yeah. And Di, the rival, yeah. Then you have Zijian Cao Zhi, yeah. So Owen just translates it here as Cao Zhi, who was the son of Cao Cao, and thus he was a prince of the state of Wei during the Three Kingdoms era. And he was a very important poet, actually. He was especially important in terms of influence, I would say, because it was sort of his very personal and direct style of shi poetry that led to the development in later stages of the Tang style shi poetry, which we are reading here now. So shi kan zi jian qing. Qing, yeah, so he fancies himself to be like a relative, or if he was a close relative to him, poetically speaking, he was a descendant of Cao Zhi. So the whole couplet he sort of mentions what he thought of himself and his literary ability. And since his literary ability didn't really go down, presumably after his 25th birthday, this is what he thought of his literary capability even here. So we have to sort of understand this sort of frustration with not getting what he thinks he deserves, which sort of really seeps through and is very transparent in this poem. And it was really also something that all like following generations would agree with. Like here Du Fu is the star and everyone else is like circling around him. He's the sun and everyone else is the solar system. But even the other ones are nobodies, right? But in that time, it wasn't like that. Wei Ji was an important person, and Du Fu had to suck up to him. And that's really an irony when you see this now. We can't imagine it, can we? He's so much more important than these nobodies. And they didn't know it. Also, this whole poem is really very free form. If we look at the rhymes and everything, it's not a parallel like a 排律 it doesn't have parallel couplets and everything. It's more like a long letter in 5-word lines, more or less. He goes on to brag about himself. 李邕求使面，王罕愿补陵. This is also interesting and obscure if we don't get an historical note with explanations. So Li Yong was a high-ranking public official and a preeminent writer who was of the same generation as Du Fu's father. And there's an earlier poem dedicated to him in Du Fu's collection. And here he's mentioned as an example of a literary figure of standing. So Du Fu is here also bragging of the literary people, the literary men that wanted to sort of stay close to him. And because Li Yong was a writer, it was probably in his capacity as a poet that Du Fu caught his interest. And another interesting thing, which I will hopefully return to in a decade or two, is that Du Fu has a late masterpiece also dedicated to him. And at that point, Li Yong had already been killed in factional struggles at the court. Actually, at this point, when this was written, he might already have been dead, actually. Well, I don't know about that. He was done to death by the evil chancellor, Li Linfu. Then we have Wang Han. Actually, Wang Han, I don't know anything about this person, but he is presumably also a poet or a writer. So this Wang Han person, he wanted to settle in my neighborhood, and yeah, Jesus, I mean, I would be so flattered if anyone thought my literary capabilities were so high that they wanted to settle in my block, right? So Buling is settle in my neighborhood. Is literally to sort of use divination to find out if a place is good for settlement. But Buling, it means basically just to settle in a certain place. We go on. 自谓颇挺出, I thought I was quite exceptional. Yes, we know Du Fu, it's already been established. 立登耀路经. So 挺出, stand out, yes, outstanding is literally what it means. And he thought that he would at once occupy some crucial position. Yes, that's the crucial position is the translation of 耀路经. Jing is a ford, the place where you cross a river. So, 耀路经 is literally the place where an important road crosses a river. So it's a metaphor for an important position in society. And 耀经 actually by its own also has the same significance of a person who holds high office. Here we get to Du Fu's really his highest ambition. 治君尧舜上，再使风俗淳. And this has been quoted over and over again as an example of Du Fu's high ambitions. And he says similar things in various other places in his works as well. So it can really be believed to have been his highest ambition, to make my lord greater than Yao or Shun. This is essentially is the dream of a righteous subject, and it's not at all an original sentiment. But Du Fu's position, even spiritually, is to be a righteous subject. He doesn't want to lead; he wants to be a help for a divine ruler to lead his country and transform the population and the culture. And it should also perhaps be pointed out that this ambition of being a help to one's lord and making customs pure, it has really nothing to do, in principle, it has nothing to do with conservatism or with just admiring the ancients, even though Yao or Shun are the greatest mythical emperors of ancient mythological China, right? It has nothing to do with conservatism. It's merely the belief or the dream that perfect virtue in government is an ever-present possibility, and that's the belief of all educated Confucians. And Du Fu, that's why Du Fu is so representative and so archetypal and important in that tradition. 词意尽萧条，行歌非引轮. So 词意is these thoughts, the ambitions that were just mentioned. So he's frustrated and disappointed. Bleak, 萧条, yeah. 行歌, he went along singing 非隐伦. 隐伦 is to be a hermit. A person whose spiritual soundness comes from rejecting worldly ambition, and whose spiritual fulfillment is found in renunciation, and that was never Du Fu's path. So he was never to become a hermit. He would never give up his dreams of putting his lord above Yao and Shun. That is really important to understand Du Fu. And this is so much more central, actually, to his own outlook on the world than being this sort of worldly minstrel that the People's Republic and Marxist critics and whatever want to make him into. He is a Confucian through and through, and he embodies and expresses the essence and the most beautiful and valuable things in the Confucian tradition. And that's why he is important. 骑驴30载，律师金华春. I rode a donkey for 13 years. 13 it says here, 30, 30 it says in the Chinese text. 30 is the text that we have, the received text. And the reason the change is made is because Du Fu was only around 40 years old at this point. But, he may have considered himself as pursuing a poetic career with these sacred political ambitions constantly since his youth. So, Sanshi is not necessarily a mistake, but it may also indeed be a mistake. A donkey then is presumably a poor person's ride, like rich people ride horses, but he has to ride a donkey. And 律师金华春, dined as a sponger. Yes, he ate as a guest. It's perhaps a more understandable translation. In other people's homes. So 律师. This is an expression of bitterness. And this is a theme, actually, that will return over and over in Du Fu's poems, because he was always basically just traveling around and never settling and never really finding his place and depending quite a lot on other people's gifts and well-treatment. 律师金华春, the capital's splendor, the springtime of the capital's splendor. Yeah, so everything is beautiful around him, but he has so much bitterness in his heart because he has to dine as a sponger. Here he has to be a guest in other people's homes. He continues to describe his bitterness. 朝叩富尔门，目随肥马尘，残悲与冷炙，到处谦卑心. Yeah, I mean, he uses painfully direct language here. This is really his sense of being a failure. Everywhere he goes, he's treated like a nobody. They give him leftovers to eat. It's shameful. And really, you have to wonder a bit about Du Fu's relation to this Wei Ji person that he writes to, because he dares to reveal these shameful things. So he clearly respects and trusts Wei Ji, but he's also very frustrated and disappointed with him. I don't think there's anything I need to comment on it language-wise here. You can just compare with the English translation. I think most things will be clear. We go on. Here he mentions like an interesting historical occurrence, actually. 主上请见正，虚然欲求生，清明却垂翅，蹭等五纵灵. This actually refers to quite a ridiculous incident, which Du Fu may not have had complete insight into, I think. The story is that in 747 or thereabout, the Emperor Xuanzong decided to summon men of talent to a special examination. And then there was, of course, the corrupt and evil Chancellor Li Linfu, who is really sort of the bad guy of Tang Dynasty history, who was perhaps reasonably afraid that if a lot of sort of unvetted persons came in the presence of the emperor and just started speaking their mind, the emperor might sort of get a grip on what Li Lingfu was doing. So he feared this, and he didn't think it was a good idea. And to sort of counteract this order of the emperor, he made sure that no one actually passed this examination. And then he congratulated the emperor and said, look, no one has turned up, no one passed the examination, and this means that no talent in the empire has been overlooked. Quite interesting. And Du Fu was then among the men who tried his luck in this huge sham. So that's what this is about. So let's look at this language-wise. Zhu Shang then is the emperor, his majesty. And Qing Jian Zheng. The emperor asked me to be summoned. Zheng is here to summon. Xu Ran, suddenly I was going to try to expand. Yes, my presence was going to expand into the imperial aura, something like that, yeah. 虚然欲求生. But in the dark heavens, 清明, yes, 清明 is just heaven, but yeah, dark heavens, in its aspect of depth and unreachable height, I would say. This is a bird metaphor. Obviously, he compares himself with a bird. 垂翅, to droop with his wings. It's a rather conventional metaphor now, perhaps it wasn't then. And then 蹭等, lost footing. Yeah, thus, because he lost footing, he failed. Yeah, so he failed. And this is a fish metaphor, or a whale metaphor. Ply my fins freely. 纵 ling, this is ling is fins then. And yeah, this all refers back also to this 物生 in the first couple of lines. It's difficult for a man in a scholar's cap to make his way in the world. That's really a theme that Du Fu returns to again and again. And not just Du Fu, of course. It's like a really beloved motif in scholarly poetry for obvious reasons. 圣愧丈人后, 圣之丈人真. He really wants to say, I don't want to blame you, sir. Something like this. Your kindness, sir. Ho is kindness, or rather generosity, I would say. Puts me deeply to shame. I really know your sincerity. Yes, sincerity, which is here, Zhen sincerity. This is what is explained or exemplified by the next couplet. Because Wei Ji, he really appreciated Du Fu's poetry, which we can see here. 美于百僚上，委宋家具兴. Ever 于百僚上, before all the 100 officers. 百僚, this 僚 would more normally be written with a 人字旁 here, and not this roof. But this is what it looks like in my book. 为宋家具兴. Yes, so he would recite Du Fu's poems in the company of high-ranking officials, which of course is good for Du Fu, but it didn't help really with Du Fu's career anyway. Perhaps they didn't understand them, or for some other reason, it didn't help. You go too far, that's what is translated here with Wei. Wei, of course, this is really a word of humility. So Wei, go too far. It's like you add shame to yourself for my sake. That's the idea. Or it could be Ru or something like that as well. So Du Fu, he sort of recognizes the appreciation that he has received, but he wants more. He needs a recommendation, he needs a job, and that we see also in the next chapter, and which contains an allusion which we have to straighten out. 窃笑共工喜, 南甘原县平, or two allusions to historical figures. So this 共工, this is a serious case of obscure allusion, I must say, but this allusion nevertheless occurs with some regularity in Chinese poetry. So let's explain this. Gong Gong was a man called Gong Yu, who was a good friend with Wang Ji, the Han Dynasty general. And when Wang Ji took office, this Gong or the Gong Yu, he is said to have dusted his cap. That is, he expected a position anytime. You know, my friend got a good position. Obviously, I'm going to have a nice position soon anyway. So what Du Fu is saying is that since he's friends with Wei Ji, he's been happy like Gong Yu for some time. And he doesn't want to remain poor, you know. So, cheer, this word is usually just refers to oneself in a humble way as well. So cheer is also a word of humility. Like in my inner, like to myself, almost without admitting it, I emulate the delight of Lord Gung, the happiness of this Mr. Gung when his friend got a promotion, because he doesn't want to remain poor like Yuan Xian. And here's another of these allusions which I'll go through. Yuan Xian, this is a story of one of Confucius's disciples, Zigong, I think. Yuan Xian was a person who in his an acquaintance of his. When he met him, he was wearing bad clothes and he looked emaciated and everything. And Zigong said, "Is there something wrong with you?" or something like that. And Yuan Xian, he just said, "No, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm just poor," basically. You know, thereby sort of bringing into contrast the difference between sort of a moral failing and a material sort of societal failure. And this is what Du Fu, he can't stand this anymore. It's hard to accept. Nan Gan, it's hard to accept to be poor like Yuan Xian. Even though, you know, he knows that there's nothing wrong with him in matters of virtue or capability. This is so immensely interesting, isn't it? How much the Du Fu and other poets are able to fill into just 10 characters like this. It goes on. 焉能心泱泱，只是走圈圈. This translation, I don't think is exactly correct, actually. Yang Yang, of course, is miserable, like something like that, more or less. How could I ever be miserable inside my heart? It's just that I don't get anywhere with my life. This is the way I understand this. Because chun chun doesn't mean to hurry away. At least when I look it up in the dictionary, chun chun means to go forward and then backwards, you know, making no progress. So he's constructing a contrast here in this couplet between, you know, his mental state, which is not despairing. How could he ever despair? You know, he has the source of all virtue and the key to 1,000 books inside his bosom. But, you know, in practical terms, he's just not getting anywhere. And that's the problem. So, you know, he's not getting anywhere, so now he's going to try it in the east. 金与东入海, 即将西去秦. So they are in Chang'an here, and Du Fu is going west. He's going east. He's going to Luoyang. So this, like going to the sea, is an exaggeration, or at least it's an echo of Confucius, you know, when the way does not prevail in the world, take to sea on a raft, this sort of thing. He's going east anyway, and he's leaving the western lands of Qin behind. 上连终南山，回首亲卫兵. Yeah, nothing strange here. 终南山, of course, are the mountains next south of Chang'an, and the Clear Wei is a river that runs north of Chang'an, I think. So there's two rivers there, the Jing and the Wei, and the one is clear, it's the Wei, and the other one is muddy, so that's why it's called the Clear Wei here. He says here basically he will miss Zhongnanshan, and he will miss the river Wei. The point is obviously he will still think of Wei Ji that he leaves behind, the recipient of the poem, because 常你报一饭，况怀慈大臣. Always I've intended to repay that one meal. Yeah, so repaying the kindness of a meal is important. And you know what this Wei Ji character has done is so much more than that. You know, he's a great official, huh? So this is rather ambiguous, isn't it? Like, does he mean that he has got more than food from him? I mean, it seems like that. You know, he has recited his poems at court and stuff. But, you know, when he says, I wanted to repay the one meal, and also, like, you're a great official. It sounds also from this couplet that it's like he has got less than he could expect, which is exactly the case, I think. The final couplet. 白鸥莫浩荡，万里谁能驯? The white guy disappears in the boundless expanse of sea. This 浩荡 is usually used about sea or sea-like things. And 万里谁能驯? Across thousands of leagues, you can say, oh, so okay, he compares himself to like a white gull here. This is a somewhat dull ending, I must say. It's like a fade out of a great song. You know, like when a great song, then they don't know how to find an ending for them, so you just make it fade out and repeat, like the refrain or repeat, blah, 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 blah. This is a little bit like that. You know, he doesn't know how to tie this together. But of course, what he's trying to say is quite complicated, so that's not so strange. That's it. That's the whole 22 couplets, or the 22 rhymes. So 44 lines here. And didn't we get to know quite a lot about Du Fu's ideas about himself and his ambitions as well? This is an important poem for all those reasons. And, you know, it just makes me sad. And it's made 1,000 years of Chinese readers sad as well to think about Du Fu, you know, this brilliant person with such immense literary talent who just didn't get anywhere in the world. And, you know, people appreciated him, but, you know, he never really had the opportunity to sort of use his capabilities. And instead, you know, the empire was just losing it on every front. Well, that's what life is like. Life is a tragedy sometimes. So thank you for listening to this, and see you next time.